Hello, everybody, and welcome to Do Right by Your Research Data. I'm Sadie, and I'm going to be moderating today. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to add them to the Q&A, where you can also see other people's questions and upvote them, and we're trying to get to as many of those as possible, or have some discussions in the chat if that's more useful to answer each other's questions. There will also be some activities during the session, so you should go to that Google Doc, which you can get to at bit.ly/dorightdata. The link is in the chat, and just make sure if you're typing it in yourself that you capitalize the first letter of do, write, and data, because it's case sensitive. To get started, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Amy Nurnberger is the program head for data management services and the interim head for data and specialized services at MIT Libraries. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here, and take it away, Amy.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sadie. And thank you to TLO for organizing this intellectual property speaker series. It's really such an opportunity to bring all of this knowledge together in one series so that people can sample it and really dig into the parts that they're interested in. So today we're going to be talking about research data specifically and the rights, responsibilities, and licenses and legal instruments associated with it. So as far as your setup, do your regular Zoom thing, type your names in. It looks like we're all in that space already. We're going to be doing a presentation mainly by PowerPoint with some activity with a Google Doc. We don't have too many people today, so we may or may not use the Google Doc. We'll see how that goes. Go ahead and ask questions the way you normally would. As Sadie said, go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A and upvote those ones that you're particularly interested in hearing answers to or discussion about, and we'll get to them as we can. So, as Sadie mentioned, my name is Amy Nurnberger. I head up the Data Management Services program in the libraries. Sadie is the head of our archives program and is also a member of the Data Management Services team. Again, thank you to Robin Bunch and Hara of TLO for putting this together, and Catherine Dunn from the libraries for acting as another coordinator for this series. First thing I want to put out there straight up, we are not lawyers. This is not legal advice. There are a bunch of services and supports available at MIT that are staffed by lawyers who can give you legal advice, and this will help you sort through which of those resources you should go to for which questions, how they might be able to help you, what are the things you should have in mind as you go seek out those services. If you're interested in other classes or services from Data Management Services, we have a whole list of workshops, and all of our materials are publicly available and accessible. We also have a web guide if you're interested in exploring some of those. If you have any further questions that we can help you out with, we are available for individual consultations as well as group teachings, learnings, and consultations, so please do reach out. Now, into the meat of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start out by looking at what do we mean when we talk about research data as a specific type of object, as intellectual property? What are some of the concerns around privacy or participation in that space of research data? Thinking about different ideas around security, how that impinges on sharing or can even enable different types of sharing. And then some of the other legal aspects in that area around how copyright, licensing, or data use agreements might apply to that. So one of the first questions is data. Just as a heads up to you, oftentimes I found people are sensitive as to whether this is used as a singular or a plural. Just as a warning, I am going to be using it both ways, so just prepare your ears for that. So getting into what is the difference between a fact versus data versus the specific topic of research data, that specific object of research data. So really what we're looking at and talking about today is research data. And you can see here the definition that's given by the Office of Management and Budget out of the White House. And it's really looking at the activity of research and scholarship and the factual materials that are needed to support claims that are made in that space, or items that are discovered, revealed, introduced, created during the process, the activity of research and scholarship. And these are distinct from both facts and data. It's kind of drilled down, as you see on the slide. Fact is anything, data are measurements and recording, and research data are those materials that are data, in essence, that are revealed during the process of research. Now, also in the space of research data, we usually interpret this to mean any of the materials necessary to effectively understand and use that research data. So it might be when you think about data, you think of this structured table, but we're going to extend that definition a little bit. So like I said, research data is commonly accepted as what is necessary to validate research findings. And you can see here, this is a current working definition at MIT that was developed by the MIT Open Access Task Force implementation team. And this is kind of the guideline that we use to think about what we mean when we say research data at MIT. And you can see in this that it's not just the table of numbers, right? There's a lot more that's involved in this space. Recordings, measurements, different stages of data, whether that's raw data or processed data, could be audio data, video data, visual images can fall into that space as well as, software, analysis scripts, documentation of that data. So the metadata can also be thought of as part of that overall package of research data. And it really comes down to all of these different types of data that are necessary to validate research findings or that are produced in the course of research itself. So these cover things like tools, like metadata, like supporting information. And some example of these tools, like I mentioned before, is we have analysis script and algorithms. There are things like RCode or Jupyter notebooks that can definitely fall under that tools umbrella as well. Models, neural nets, as we get more into machine learning, constructing AI, neural networks, things like that. These all are in that space of tools and part of that hazy boundary of what we mean when we say research data. So part of what we need to extend our thoughts to include there. It also includes metadata. So thinking about what are the things that are, I give you the context about that data or give extra meaning to that data. And this can include everything from the conditions at the time of collection, maybe what instrument was used to collect that data. It can often be either in a structured format, so you might have heard of something like a metadata schema, which tends to be structured, or more unstructured in something like a README file. But all of these tend to be created as part of the research project itself or as part of documenting the data. And in essence, the data cannot be effectively understood or used without this metadata portion of that research data package. And then finally, there's supporting information that also falls into this space. So thinking about if you're doing interviews or surveys, that survey instrument, you might have a code book that indicates different codes, the different codes that are used in your research. This is especially for qualitative research, oftentimes where free text is coded and what those codes mean or what those abbreviation means. You might have something like a data dictionary that again gives definitions for different elements within your research, expected results, things like that. Again, it's part of that overall documentation that gives meaning and effective reuse to your data. So what I'd like to do at this point is first open it up for any questions that you might have around what are we talking about when we're talking about research data, but also what are some examples of the research data that you work with or have worked with or have dealt with in other spaces. And you can see this is where you have an opportunity to either enter something in chat, and that's fine. If that's easier for you, or go ahead and go to that Google Doc and put some of your responses in there. This way we can see what each other here is thinking about when you're thinking about research data, and what are your kind of assumptions in that space? What is research data? So I see a couple of responses. Definitely user interviews are one of those, especially if you're doing something like UX research, thinking about that, or other type of research involved with how someone is using a product of some type of thing, and all of the tools invested in that interview process can be considered part of your research data package. That's the interview instrument if you're doing a structured interview. It could be paradata associated with that interview, so details about how that interview was conducted or any other contextual information about the actual conduct of the interview, as well as the actual responses of the interviewee. And further on down, working with the stream, working with that data, it could be the coding of that interview, and eventually a transformation of that qualitative data into a quantitative reading if the interviews are taken together and coded, processed using natural language processing, done some topic modeling on that. You could do sentiment analysis on those, all sorts of other things that eventually could come out of something that seems as that is a user interview or that process. And certainly those other ideas in that information architecture, yes, that can be part of your metadata as well as other aspects of your research information. And the prototype test results, yes, very much. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Any other questions in the space of what we're talking about when we're talking about research data? All right, excellent. Well, that's our first topic down. We're going to move now into thinking about privacy and participation in research data. And oftentimes we talk about privacy and we talk about security. And what I've often found to be a useful distinction between these two is that privacy establishes the framework about who should have access to what information, and security is how you implement those decisions that you've made. So data privacy, we're talking about appropriate use of data. Data security, we're talking about how to ensure that data privacy, how to confirm those choices that we've made about data privacy. So it's really thinking about who should have access to what data when. So the first question is often about who. Who are the research stakeholders? Who is in this space of research? We had someone earlier talking about user interviews, and certainly, within that space, you have the researchers themselves. You have potentially research funders or partners in your research. You have your user test population, who might be the research stakeholders, and you might even have eventually your larger user population as stakeholders in the research itself. And so keeping all of these stakeholders in mind is really important. And one of the tools I like to point to in thinking about this is something called the CARE guidelines. Oftentimes when you're in the research data space, you will hear people using an acronym called FAIR, which stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable Research Information. And these are just a handy set of principles to be thinking about when you're thinking about your research data, both for your own benefit as well as for the benefit of the larger research community. But the other side of this are the CARE principles. When you're thinking about stakeholders in your researchers, you want to think about collective benefit for the research as a whole. Who might have the authority to control the results of the research? What are the different responsibilities that different stakeholders have within that research space? And also, what are the ethical standards that are common either to that space or to that place wherein that research is being conducted? So that idea of collective benefit is really taking into thinking about, again, who could be benefiting from this research, right? There's certainly The research group itself, or the principal investigator, is like, oh my goodness, I'm exploring interesting things. I'm developing products. I'm discovering new areas. I'm pushing the human knowledge further, right? So there's that, and outside of that, again, like we said, there are certainly funders who thought this was a good idea to fund, and they might have their own perceptions of how they're going to benefit. There's the user community, or community often that this research is going to sit within. If you're thinking about human participants in the health sphere, there's a whole patient space in that. If you're thinking about sociological research, if you're talking with communities, there are those communities to think about that as well. If maybe you're a little bit further away from what we might think of human interaction with some of your research, there are other populations to think about in that space as well. And when you're considering what the collective benefit, what the stakeholder community might be for that particular research. And within that, something to keep in mind is, what are the community's rights? This comes much more into play when you are working with human participants or elements of research that impact humans. So say you're doing something like on a pollution research, right? And you're not really interacting much with the community itself, but the results of your research are going to impact a community who's associated maybe with a polluted area, something like that. So considering what are the interests, and if you're collecting information about that community, what is that authority to control in that space? And these all play into where responsibility sits for the care and keeping of that data. What are the different spaces of responsibility? And how does our ethical framework influence the choices that we're making in those spaces? So that's kind of like thinking about who should have access to which data. This is not only in terms of thinking about how or why data might be restricted, but who might be impacted by that data in other spaces as well. So thinking broadly about who should have access to the data. The next part of privacy is, what data are we talking about at different stages? Now, within data, we often have legally protected data elements, as we know, as personally identifiable information, personal health information, things like that. But we can also have sensitive information in that. And this could be employment records, financial data, other proprietary data that shouldn't be shared with the public. And this often comes to the fore when we're thinking about industry partnerships or other legally restricted data, such as controlled unclassified information within the federal framework. Or even if we're talking about some biological field research has restrictions around protected populations of different birds or plant life or things like that. So there are multiple ways where information can be sensitive, and it's really trying to identify what is the sensitivity associated with your data. Now, fortunately at MIT, we have a program called MIT Info Protect, and you can see the link on the slide, but they've developed a really nice tool to help us understand the different risk levels. At the very low level, it's either information that's already available publicly, or it's information that maybe the institute or the industry partner hasn't chosen to disclose, but that wouldn't be a big deal or cause material harm if it was disclosed. At the next level, there's the medium risk level. And it's really stuff that shouldn't be out in the public. It's just not a good idea. There should be access controls around it, where there might not be, is where the loss of confidentiality or integrity is going to cause a legal liability or reputational damage, or maybe some other type of harm. Right? And then finally, there's that high level, which is this information is subject to legal and regulatory requirements. If there's a breach, there will be trouble. This will cause serious harms to individuals or the institute. But like I said, the MIT Info Protect tool does a really nice job of asking you questions about your information so that you can make a decision about what risk level your information has associated with it. And then it also gives you a list of actions that you can take to implement the security, implement the necessary protections associated with each of those risk levels. The last item in this idea of privacy is, when should people have access to that information? Because oftentimes throughout research, information changes throughout that process of research itself. So there's a difference between having access to the raw data versus having access to clean data or the results of analysis. And as you can tell, those different stages of information processing is gradually going to probably remove some of the sensitive information from data. But then we also have the sense of time and distance from the event at hand. And this is also plays into when someone might have access to information and what that access might mean. So it's really taking into account this balance between stakeholders and risks that might be associated with re-identification, de-anonymization, or other risks associated with breaching secure or data that should be restricted. Now, basic privacy strategies in this space is, first of all, to know what data you have, where it is. And that's something that we often deal with in data management services, is helping you set up your infrastructure, your ecosystem for your research information, your research data. So it's really easy for you to answer that question about what is it that you have, where does it live, how can you find it, who has access to it. And then there's understanding your data sensitivity. Like I said, InfoProtect is a really good tool in this space. There's also a great tool that MIT IS&T offers called Spirion that can scan your data files for sensitive information like social security numbers, credit card numbers, things like that. One of the other principles in this space is to only collect the information you need. So it might feel like, oh, it would be really interesting to know this thing too, but ask yourself, is it necessary to have that information? How much risk does that extra information expose your data to? Does that raise your risk level? And then reconsider whether or not you actually need that extra information. And then finally, collect responsibly and manage effectively in these spaces, the information that you have. Know what your environment enables and know what it allows. Know how to implement the security measures that you can in that space. Some other privacy resources, here are links. These links are available to you, and I know Sadie has been putting, thank you Sadie, has been putting links to the slides, so you don't have to copy these all down or take screenshots. The slide deck is available to you after this presentation, after the workshop. So with that, we've covered some of those ideas about privacy, and that allows us to move into questions about security, right? Now that we've thought about what does privacy mean, how do we think about participation in the research endeavor, how does that influence what we think about when we think about security? And one of the things that we like to say in this area of research data is that we want to be able to implement those privacy choices in a way that supports scholarship and fulfills the requirements that we have either to our funders, our institution, our partners, our other stakeholders in that research endeavor. And a handy phrase for this is to think about your research information as keeping it as open as possible, but as secure as necessary. So the first instinct there is towards openness, and then thinking about, okay, which parts of these do I need to shut down or restrict in some way? And security practices can be implemented via operating systems, software updates. You can put passwords in place. Backups are a great way not to lose your data, which is another aspect of security. It's not just who has access to it, but it's part of knowing where your data is and being able to put your hands on that research information. Having an inventory of the types of information that you have, and putting in some of those other protections. Like I said, the InfoProtect site is really useful here to point you to different resources that are appropriate for the risk level associated with your research information. Some of the other tools that MIT gives you are around encryption, an MIT account for a password manager. I cannot say enough good things about the utility of a password manager in making your life easier. I mentioned that Spirion tool for finding sensitive data, and also, of course, preventing malware becoming resident on your computing equipment, because that's another security breach area. I encourage you to look at some of the other options here as well in terms of implementing your privacy choices through security. And then we get into that question of, okay, I've made this stuff secure, so what research data can I share? how do I do that effectively? How do I define and pull out what I should be sharing of my research information? So what the federal funders say for the most part, again, we go back to that definition of research data and what's included in the sharing. Now, we are seeing a couple changes in federal funders. The NIH has come out with a new data management and sharing plan. NASA is coming out with something similar in terms of defining which data must be shared coming out of those grants. And this is something where they are both extending the definition from what used to be, you have to share the data that supports articles that are published, to you need to share data of scientific value that is produced during the research activity, whether or not it is used as part of a published article. So that's something to keep in mind, how these understandings of research data and what should be shared is shifting. I'm really interested in what you say about sharing research data. What do you think? I really like this this Twitter comment here about that idea of why is it that we think about research as sharing data? And you go back in the history of scholarship and you get the Royal Society, which their motto was it in nulla verbia, Latin, not my language, but essentially it's take no one's word for it. You got to bring your evidence to the table for research, for scholarship. You got to show people what you're basing your claims on. And this is where that idea of data sharing comes from, because it's thinking about trusting people's conclusions, being able to validate that those findings through replication, being able to have that reliability associated with these findings. And, of course, that redounds onto, how does society trust scientific research and scientific findings and the findings of the research endeavor? That idea that if we can't trust each other and use each other's data, if we can't trust each other's data and build on our experiments and our research, that old Newton thing of standing on the shoulders of giants so that you can see further, right? If we can't do that thing, then what are we even doing in the space of research and scholarship? It's a monumental waste of effort if we're not saying, hey, here's what I did, here's how I did it, here's how we can build on this in the future, whether it's yourself building on that in the future or someone else in the research environment and field. So I'm interested. So what are your thoughts about what research data should be shared? What are your experiences with that? And again, go ahead and put something in chat or Q&A or into the Google Doc. I'm interested in your thoughts in this space. Yeah, I'm seeing a response here in the Google Doc, and thank you for that, about peer-reviewed data. This is a really fascinating area. Just that idea of what does it mean to peer-reviewed data, and the fact that there's such a variety in responses of that, not just between disciplines, but also within disciplines. But also the other facet of that is where do the resources come from to do that review of data? And it comes back to my mind, it comes back to the idea of how do we know that we can trust the data? What are the indicators of trust? Which is that's a whole nother topic. But I think it's a really interesting area of exploration, that idea of we do peer review so that we have an assurance that we can trust the data, that the data is quality data. In those things. Certainly the consensually obtained data, and this is why we have at MIT the CUIs that will help with the consent forms and thinking about participant rights within the research space and what are the necessary protections for those. So thank you very much for that. Any other thoughts or questions in that space of privacy, security, thinking about participant rights in data or other research stakeholder rights in data, as well as security implementations and how that flows through to the sharing of data, which is something that we're seeing encouraged and even required more and more frequently. I see a question in chat here that can non-peer-reviewed data be shared before publication for verification? Absolutely. There are many caveats to that. Absolutely. That as a basic answer, is that possible? Yes, it is. It depends on your discipline and disciplinary understandings and things like that. But it's often something that in some spheres is really encouraged, is to share that data for verification beforehand as part of the open science endeavor, with the idea that, the more eyes you have on something that can help you see an issue with it, the better, because no one wants to, invest time going down a path that isn't going to be productive because there are issues with data or issues with analysis or things like that. In my experience, most data that is shared is in fact non-peer reviewed out there, simply because of the issues that I mentioned before around what is peer review of data and the lack of resources to both carry out peer review of data and also lack of definitions for what that might mean for a specific area. Does that, and if you're interested in other resources for sharing data, we have those for you, and more questions about what does it look like to share data at different stages within research or scholarship. These are many of the questions that we answer in data management services and work with you to find effective workflows, processes, tools, platforms for sharing that data in ways that are responsible, and that also work with you as a researcher or research group to make sure that you're getting credit for the work that you've invested in developing that data, which is a really important part of that whole scholarly ecosystem as well. Yeah, that's another question in chat is, how does one balance trade secret sensitive data with research verification and balancing those security and privacy aspects? Excellent question, and something that is going to be specific probably to that particular research or industry partnership agreement. And so in the next section, we are going to get into data use agreements. And oftentimes it's within the data use agreement that you see those conditions laid out more specifically around which data can be shared and which can't be. And I think going into that partnership negotiation with any type of research partner with this idea in mind about what is the ultimate expected outcome of the research, which of that data that you expect to collect within the course of research is information that you want to be able to share at the end of this. And this will help inform the data use agreement that you come to at those initial stages of creating that partnership and creating that collaboration, and really determine a lot of the future success related to that partnership or collaboration. All right, thank you for those. Next, we're going to move into some of the legal tools that we have around controlling access and implementing intellectual property around research data. So how do we share data? If we've gotten to the point of like, yes, I want to share my data, and to the questions mentioned in chat, how do we share data effectively? How do we balance these concerns? Through copyright, licensing, and use agreements. Again, this is a little bit of a hierarchy about where these different things apply in the space. So in the United States of America legal framework, facts are not subject to copyright. You have to have a creative work in order to copyright it. So copyright isn't going to be like, I got up and I took the temperature today, and I don't know, but my temperature today was like 19 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a fact. Saying it's 19 degrees Fahrenheit, not copyrightable because it's fact. So it doesn't protect, copyright doesn't protect concepts, principles, discoveries, all of those types of things. But What it can protect are things like the metadata that's associated with your research information. It can protect things like software. It can protect all of these other things that surround that data that's kind of the kernel of your research information, but there's all this contextual information that we talked about before that falls within that scope, within that definition of research data that copyright does in fact come into play with. So it's really thinking about which parts of my research can be considered fact and which parts are more creative, which parts can be protected by copyright, and then being able to think about what that means in the space of sharing. So we go back to thinking about what could be protected by copyright. Those are your code books, right? Those are your survey instruments, your data dictionaries. Those are all protected by copyright. Analysis scripts, software, protected. README files, metadata, these are all protected by copyright as a legal structure. So we're talking about copyright that could apply to research data that you've produced, research data that you've sourced from other places, and it does get to be a little bit complex. Some resources I really recommend to you around questions of copyright include the previous talks in this series. I have here the basics of copyright from last year, but I believe there are also recordings available about the basics of copyright from this year, so updated. And we have the MIT Library Scholarly Publishing and Copyright Office as well that I would recommend to you for questions around copyright and how copyright comes into play within that space of research data and research information. Particularly, our data management services program does work closely with our copyright program in order to answer those types of questions for you. One of the other tools that we have in thinking about our research information, our research data packages, is licensing, right? When we get beyond copyright, or if we're like, I have copyright, but I want to be able to license that in a different way, be able to let someone know, be able to communicate to someone how they can use this material, whether it's something that is under copyright or is under some other use regimen. And copyright, like I said, is complicated, which is why licensing can be so useful. It's that communication tool. Licensing is a legal instrument, and within the realm of research data, we found it to be most useful as an indicator to let people know how they can use the thing. And it's important to recognize that there's a difference between something being license-free and having free license, right? If something is license-free, it just means that you're stuck in a state of, I don't know what can be done with this. I have no clue. Whereas a free license indicates that it has a license, and the license associated with it allows these certain free uses of the material. The most common ones that we often see within the research data space is a public domain release, or something that says, I can retain copyright, but you can pretty much do whatever you would like with this material, as long as you give me credit, right? Like that's the Creative Commons BY type license, CC BY in that space. But regardless, whenever you're thinking about licensing, please do reach out to our licensing people here at MIT, the TLO office. They have an amazing slate of people to help you with questions of licensing and the complexities associated with licensing. There's all sorts of really neat things that you could actually do with licenses that you might not have considered. And those legal structures can work really well to help you achieve what you want to in terms of sharing your research information. It's not so much just a, yes, you can use it, no, you can't use it, but you can actually structure some of these licenses to say, hey, you can use it for these types of things, but maybe if you're like invested in these types of things, we need to talk a little bit more about that, or there might be other restrictions or conditions of use applied to that, right? And all of that can happen in the license as a legal instrument associated with your research information and materials. Like I said, TLO should be your first stop for questions of licensing, but what we usually see within that space of research data specifically is either the public domain or a copyright change and credit required, a CC BY type license associated with it. And one note in there is oftentimes people think there's a general conception that copyright requires you to cite something, like get credit for something. And that's simply not the case at all. Citation and reference giving, credit giving is something that's usually done within the research space as a norm. It's considered, it's a sociological taboo, in effect, to take someone else's work and claim it as your own. But copyright does not provide the legal structure for requiring citation or reference. However, the CC BY license does implement that legal requirement for credit, for citation, for reference in that space, although it's not something that's commonly pursued because most people who use a CC BY license just don't have like the legal energy to be like, hey, you didn't cite me, I'm going to sue you, type of thing, which is why we often see a CC0 just because it's easier for everyone all around and has the same effect. Finally, there are different licenses, as I mentioned, that can do different things, but at the base of it all, they communicate how the object in hand can be used, right? And I mentioned before that you can structure licenses to allow different types of use. And here are some examples of that, whether it's a commercial use versus private use, whether or not you can disclose the source, whether you have to state changes that you've made to it, different liability considerations. So these are all things that go into the creation of perhaps a more complex license, if that's something that you wish to pursue because of the complex nature of the research information that you're holding on to and you would like to share. Finally, we get to the area of use agreements, and this is something that steps a little bit beyond licenses. As I mentioned before, use agreements are usually very nice to have in hand when you're pursuing a partnership or a collaboration with either a research partner or someone who's interested in using your research information. Now, here there's a resource from the University of Michigan office that is just really nice. They have this great catalog of data use agreements. And the last time I checked, it had 67 agreements with 54 different types of conditions associated with those data use agreements. So data use agreements are where you can get even a little bit more nuanced about the extreme specifics of how you are going to work together on the data set or data files or associated research information coming out of this research project. And the main areas that these topics fall in talk about what you can use the data for, what type of publications might be allowed, which parts of that data or analysis might be published or shared after that research or as a result of that research. Oftentimes there are also conditions of audit on like the environment that you're keeping the data in, or whether or not the data has been removed after a certain time point, and then penalties associated if those conditions are breached. Sometimes security is a large area of this because oftentimes use agreements are implemented when we're talking about restricted data or data that requires controlled access, so there are specific conditions that the data has to be kept under. And then extras associated with administration. So some of these types of conditions are things like you can't put new files together without letting us know, right? Maybe you can't re-identify. Maybe you have to go through certain training and awareness before allowing people access to these data. So it's this massive variety of conditions that can be structured around using and reuse of specific research information. So through the use agreement as a PI, you have a lot of control to be able to think carefully and critically about how you want this to be used. As someone who might be using someone else's data, you also have a lot of thought about how you might want to use that data and what are the restrictions that are being imposed on your use of the data and your own eventual sharing of that data. And there's some interaction there between when use agreements might conflict with other expectations for sharing of research data or other research outputs in those spaces. So something to keep in mind there. Now, I wanted to touch on security really quickly, just to give you a view of what some of the security aspects within a data use agreement cover. And this is everything from remote access policies to whether or not the computer with the data on it has to sit in a room all by itself, not connected to anything except the power cord, and the room has to be locked, and there can only be one person in the room at the time, and they better not take any USB thumb drives in with them, type of thing. So all of these, again, are different things that can be specified in a data use agreement. If you want some, there are resources at MIT to help you with these use agreements, either in interpreting them, in creating them, or agreeing to them. There's the Office of General Counsel, and I'm really excited. OSAT has just launched a new portal for non-disclosure agreements and data use agreements. Check it out. They have all sorts of things in there, everything from requesting one of these documents to training on both how to use the portal, as well as thinking through what an NDA should look like. What are different aspects of DUAs that you should consider, especially within the MIT specific framework of how we're thinking about research and scholarship and how MIT researchers operate in those spaces, and some facts as well. So definitely check that out. It's a really great resource, and I'm so happy that OSAT has put that out for all of us. So,
Amy.
Yeah.
Before we go on, there's one question about trademark in the Q&A. No, I was just,
thank you for that.
Maybe we can get it to it before we go on.
We are so close to the end. I'm just going to finish up and then get to that question.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent. So, as I mentioned, we are so close to the end. You can see we have lined out every single one of our topics, and it's really to come to this basic statement, right? That as a research community, we produce and use research data. And with that comes certain responsibilities that are associated with privacy, thinking about our participants in the research endeavor, thinking about what that means for security and for sharing of the results of research. And there are also rights that are associated with the production of the intellectual property. And these can be managed and communicated through copyright, licensing, and use agreements. And that's me. Pretty much. So, also, there are other slides in this deck that will point you to some of the resources that we've mentioned in here and some of the other resources that are available to you at MIT and other places as well. So do take a look at that slide deck to get those. And now, thank you, Sadie, for the heads up about the Q&A, the question Q&A. And that question is, trademark and know-how consists of data. How is it possible to distinguish the data making up of the trademark and know-how is not from the general research data? Yeah, that's a hard question. And the answer to that is going to be particular to every situation where you're thinking about that trademark and know-how data. It is... it's not something that there's a really good answer to yet that I'm aware of. If someone else is aware of, please do share. But not that I've been made aware of at this point. It does, that question specifically of know-how and the protections associated with know-how itself have been not well defined in that space itself. So asking the question about how does this interact with research data becomes complex. Now, often more times the know-how situation there is going to be more associated with methods than with the methodologies, than with the data itself. So you're getting into things like, so my background is lab science, so I'm just going to use an example from that. But if I'm doing something like prepping a sample, and within that there's a specific space of know-how of protected information that's there, that is unlikely to fall into the definition of research data and more about the conduct of research and the creation of that process. So that's where it gets a little bit interlaced in there. But the data resulting from the activity of the know-how would be your research data, while the know-how itself would be more research methods and practices. I hope that helps. Any other questions, comments, concerns, curiosities? Thank you so much for attending and participating, and thank you for the contributions as well. I really appreciate hearing other people's perspectives and experiences, and that really helps expand the understanding of everyone who can take part in the workshop. Say, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or yeah, that's absolutely similar to what I'm doing as well in this space. But it's good to know that other people are having those experiences too.